You are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Goodness. Thank you for joining Escape With Me Book Club. Escape with me, Sam Reiner.
And me, James Reiner.
Into our most recent read. Come with us as we evade reality and go into detail about a new book. We'll be covering the book from beginning to end, so there will be spoilers. Today we are going to the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico in the late 19th century. Published July 19th, 2022, The Daughter of Doctor Moreau is a retelling of the H.G. Wells tale, The Island of Doctor Moreau. Do the changes made to the story add to the conversations that surrounds the classic story, or has there been a misstep? So our background, we like this author. We started with Mexican Gothic with her, and then this came out afterwards, and she has a bunch of other books that I'd like for us to get to at some point. But the huge reason we're definitely doing this is because you're a massive H.G. Wells fan.
I mean, massive's a bit strong, but yes, I really like H.G. Wells.
As compared to the commoner, the common person.
As the commoner, yes. I know way too much about H.G. Wells. I've read books on him. I like science fiction. I like the Fendicical period of literature, which is when he got his start. He's considered the father of science fiction. He called it science fiction romance, but his stories and his efforts inspired later science fiction writers, probably overwhelmingly. And it's kind of the trail he blazed that made modern science fiction today. So I like science fiction. I like speculative fiction is kind of the more academic sounding broad term for it. And he's an important component to that. We just wouldn't have modern science fiction we have today without him.
There we go. But you can quote things about his life. You know about the Wellsian, which is a magazine dedicated to H.G. Wells?
It's run by the Wellsian Society. It's a society that today promotes the beliefs and goals that H.G. Wells proposed during his lifetime, like social change and scientific advancement and things like that.
Yeah, see, the normal person wouldn't know that.
I mean, yeah. But I don't know. I think I'm comparing myself to the real H.G. Wells scholars right now, and they know way more than I do. I couldn't quote names off the top of my head. I know things like he was a huge womanizer. There's a little side note about him. He loved sex. He was obsessed with wanting to have sex with women. Which,
knowing that about his person added to the story a little bit for me, but we'll get into that in a minute. Age level, this is an adult, and it's been a little bit since I've had a paragraph. So here we go. Animal cruelty and death, monsters, needles, racism, language, death of a child, blood, graphic violence, alcoholism, nudity, abuse, physical, mental, emotional, death of a spouse, death of a sibling, sex, suicide, mental illness, gore, and murder. You know, it's not as dark as Mexican Gothic.
It really isn't.
Well, we do have a nice little paragraph.
Yeah.
Which, to go and to judge a book by its cover, I thought it would be Moreau but Mexican, because that's kind of what Mexican Gothic was. It was Gothic, but Mexican. And yes, because that's all you really get from the cover. It says, The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, and the cover is a woman standing in a doorway, and she has a beautiful traditional outfit on. And so I'm like, okay, we're kind of doing it again. We're taking, instead of a genre, though, we're taking a very specific book and getting inspired by it and changing the culture a little bit on it. And yes, I feel like there's been a genre shift that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, I remember we talked about this. You thought it would be sort of a Wicked situation, a Grendel, where it's the same story, you're just getting a different perspective from it. But that's not what this book is. It's taking characters from H.G. Wells' original The Island of Doctor Moreau, and that's about it. It sets in a new location that's not an island. I know at the beginning there's this very weak explanation that the Yucatan Peninsula used to be viewed as an island, and that's sort of what's happening. But that's the bare minimum she does. After that, I don't feel like she tries at all to link it to the original book, which you read, right?
Yes, I did read it for this.
You did, and you were not a fan of it, right?
It was okay. If I wanted to have some of the conversations that I thought got brought up in that book, I would go to something like Frankenstein or maybe something else. And maybe it's just because I find those conversations more interesting, because he leans away from the what do we owe our creations and plays a little bit more into the what is humanity. And so I guess I'm more interested in the conversations you can get from Frankenstein.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. Frankenstein is definitely the superior science fiction novel in this regard. But where Mary Shelley spent a lot of time dealing with Victor Frankenstein's psyche, his struggle with, oh, what have I created? Why have I played God? Which has added to the mad scientist trope we know today. What I like about Dr. Moreau is, unlike Victor Frankenstein, he contributed to the mad scientist trope the aspect of disattachment. He does not care about his creations. He's obsessed with scientific knowledge and pursuit. He's very uncaring about the pain and destruction he's doing. He's more obsessed with getting to the answer to the question. And that has added to the mad scientist the inhumanity, the irony of it all, of course. A doctor turning animals into humans has no humanity himself. But that really added to the science fiction trope in a way that was different than Mary Shelley's mad scientist, you could say.
Yeah, I definitely do think there's obvious themes of, you see in H.G. Wells' book, the more human they act, the more animal they seem, versus the more animal they act, the more human they seem. And there's a moment where Dr. Moreau is talking about, I'm so much better than the common animal because I don't care about empathy. Empathy is a weakness, which is, I don't know anything about when he was alive, but at least now, empathy is a major characteristic of what we consider that makes us human and separates us from the animal kingdom. And so he was kind of reverting on that.
Now, I would have to say that's a very 20th century conception of that, though, because we got to realize it's the end of the 19th century when H.G. Wells wrote this. I think it was 1896.
That's why I said I don't know anything about his time period.
That time period at the turn of the century, the fin de siècle is what it's called. I'm butchering the French, but it means turn of the cycle, the end of the century.
So at this point, goodness, my poor little memory of this time period, he's mentioned Darwin.
Yes, so Darwin came out in the middle of the 19th century, and it definitely, it's a significant point in literature, science, everything. This concept of that we were once animals and we've evolved into the human beings we know today. And this had a real impact on literature, not just with H.G. Wells, of course, where everyone had this realization that really inside of us we're animals. So H.G. Wells is playing with that, of course, but then the repercussions of Darwin is where we get into the more racist aspects, which is the chain of creation, aka some animals are better than other animals. You have a hierarchy. The worm is not as developed as the dog, and the dog is not as developed as the ape, and the ape is not as developed as the human. But unfortunately, they would also split out the humans, saying, these humans are lower than those humans. The European race is more developed than the African race, is where science was trying to support this bigoted outlook. So if you look in that respect, during Wells's time, you would see a person who acts on emotions, who acts out of hunger or sex or something like that, is a lower form of human, where a person who's above all that, who's more intelligent, who's more, lack of a better word, uncaring, is a higher intelligence. So in a way, Moreau thinks he's the pinnacle of the chain of creation. He thinks, because I do not care, that makes me the better human.
Which we see in modern day society in some ways as well.
Exactly.
That's a little bit the fun of this, because I totally know nothing about him, the time period. I don't know when it was written. I thought it was the 1930s, but I was wrong, clearly.
No, it was 1896.
So I like that I do have a modern day interpretation of the story where you have the historical background.
Well, if I could add just one little other thing to give it more context.
Yeah.
So H.G. Wells wrote this book, I think a year after he wrote the book that made him famous, which is The Time Machine. And what I love is both books kind of complement each other, where The Time Machine is about a traveler going just eons into the future. A ridiculous amount into the future, to the point where he discovers humanity has diverged into two different evolutionary lines. You have the Morlocks, which are a subterranean race that are beastly and lower class and cannibalistic and brutal. And then you have a higher evolution of humanity called the Eloi. I think I'm saying that right without looking at it. But these people are gentle and social and peaceful, but they're also kind of weak. So Wells is looking to the future of man's evolution, what man could become, where Dr. Moreau is looking at man's past as a beast by looking at other animals, a doctor trying to cause other animals in the animal kingdom to be forcefully evolved into human beings. So I love how The Time Machine looks forward to man and says we're still pretty animalistic, where Dr. Moreau looks to the past of mankind and says because we were animalistic. And it's all kind of Wells's commentary on human beings. In a way, also subtly saying we should all just have sex, which is kind of a subtle theme through most of Wells's work. He was a very horny man, unfortunately.
We can only take him so serious.
Unfortunately, yeah.
He was a human being just like the rest of them.
He was a person, he was a teacher before he wrote his famous novel. He was a nobody. Suddenly he writes this book and he becomes super famous. And the fame kind of went to his head. That's why his first novels were really good pulp culture-wise. His later novels focused really hard on the social issues. And he kind of got a little too full of himself, I guess you could say. He became very popular and it fed into his ego. Anyways, we're here to talk about the daughter of Dr. Moreau, not the Island of Dr. Moreau.
So that's the reason I read it. I do think there's something really important. I feel like you'd miss something about the conversation she's trying to have because it does lean a little bit more literature than book to me in some place. And I feel like you would be missing out on the conversation she's trying to have if you don't have a lot of this other context. I feel like you'd be missing out on it, or it just really adds having this context of who is H.G. Wells, what is the Island of Dr. Moreau, and why did she feel the need to write her book the way that she did. But 100% I could tell from the title that she was a hybrid.
Oh, yeah.
What else could daughter of Dr. Moreau mean?
I mean, that's the obvious twist. If you didn't catch that, you probably haven't read many books on twists because it's pretty obvious throughout.
It was more of a twist that she didn't know.
Okay, so let's break down the plot. We have the same characters, a few of the same characters from the book, mainly just Dr. Moreau. But instead of being on an island, the scientist who's determined to figure out how to turn animals into humans through experimentation lives in the Yucatan Peninsula during the 19th century. And he's convinced a wealthy patron. So this guy who owns plantations, I want to say?
He owns haciendas, which are plantations, yes.
Yes, hacienda. So there is a lot of history she puts into it, like real world history, as in the enslavement of the native population to work for rich people on the peninsula. And this rich donor, what's his name again? You have your notes on you.
His first name is Hernando, because there are several people with his last name.
Yeah, we'll go with Hernando, right?
Yeah.
When Dr. Moreau says he can turn animals into human beings, this looks like a great opportunity to use slave labor, because he has a lot of resistance from the native population. So he thinks if he can turn animals into humans and make them laborers, it will be a really good money-making opportunity. So he funds Dr. Moreau's efforts. So Dr. Moreau is out in the jungle, and we start with him and his daughter and a few of his servants who are animals that have been turned into humans.
Minus Ramona. Ramona is the housekeeper, and she is human.
Yes, there is a human housekeeper. She's a native Yucatanian. I'm not sure what the adjective is.
She was in an abusive marriage, ran away, and now she works here. But she is the only human person beside Moreau in the beginning.
Exactly. And the book's trying to make it seem like his daughter is a real human, that her mom died and all this stuff. But it's very obvious from the very beginning that she secretly is his best experiment, that she was created from an animal, a jaguar. Except unlike Wells's original book, Dr. Moreau is not taking animals and doing what's called vivisection, which is a surgery basically, and plastic surgery of an extreme sort of turning these animals, like in the Island of Dr. Moreau, the famous one is the puma, the panther creature that he tries to turn into a woman. Puma was a popular word to use back in that time period of Wells. It's kind of fallen out of use. Now we just say the word panther or jaguar. But in The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, the author changes it. What she does is Moreau is creating these artificial wombs that he grows human hybrids in, these animal DNA that he combines together to try to create human beings. It's, be quite frank, kind of a poor man's cloning operation in a way. He's just using DNA from different animals to try to create human beings in these fake wombs. But it's very obvious that his daughter isn't really his daughter, that she's... Where the story really starts to kick in, though, is when the English gentleman comes to work for Dr. Moreau, Montgomery. In the Island of Dr. Moreau, the narrator is a shipwrecked sailor named Pendrick, who is basically our eyes and ears, our introduction to the crazy island of Dr. Moreau. And this Montgomery, he's an Englishman who comes to work for Dr. Moreau, running the hacienda that Dr. Moreau has his lab set up on. And basically, the beginning of the book shows when his daughter, Carlotta, is a little girl when Montgomery shows up.
Yes, she is 14 when the book begins.
And then basically, the beginning of the book's just setting up through interactions. Montgomery's being interviewed by Dr. Moreau and everyone to see if he's suitable for the job. And as Montgomery's introduced to the hacienda and the situation there is our gateway into, as a reader, being introduced to the scenario, which is Dr. Moreau attempting to create slave laborers out of animal DNA, basically. Then you get a time jump where Carlotta is older now. She's a young woman. Montgomery's kind of in the flow of things, running the grounds, but they're having a problem. The benefactor, he's getting upset because he doesn't feel like he's getting any results. So he's putting a lot of pressure on Dr. Moreau that if he doesn't get results soon, he's going to shut the whole thing down, which makes Carlotta and Montgomery really worried because they like their setup there. Montgomery, he's an alcoholic. He's a washout. He feels like there's nowhere else for him to go.
He has a debt that he owes specifically to Hernando.
Yeah, and he accumulated that debt because he was obsessed over a woman who never really loved him. And he just feels like his whole life has been one long, pathetic attempt at something where he always just fails at it. He's worried that this is just going to be another notch on his belt of failure, that he's just going to epically fail at all this. Where meanwhile, our other protagonists, because we get the perspective from both of them, Carlotta and Montgomery, we get Carlotta's perspective. She is in womanhood. She loves the animal hybrids.
She is the personification of the empathy that Moreau lacks.
Exactly. She loves the animal hybrids. She feels like it's her duty to protect them. She feels like this plantation they've lived on is their little world that she needs to protect.
And she literally will go and pull rotten teeth, bandage things, give them medical care because they all have extreme medical conditions because of being a hybrid. And so she's the one out there making sure that they're feeling well, that they feel safe, and all of these things. Where Moreau's on the other side just like, well, I just want to make new hybrids. I just want to keep doing what I want to do.
Yeah, he's a bit clueless. He's just obsessed with the science and his legacy, and he doesn't realize the impending doom that's coming. He's not taking seriously the threat that the whole place is going to be shut down, but Carlotta is.
Except he does, because he's like, Carlotta, why don't you just marry his son? Let's solve everything right now.
Exactly. Well, see, that's what I'm saying. He doesn't want to do the real hard work of giving what he promised, which he knows is probably impossible. Instead, he does the lazy man's out of Hernando's son shows up and has a thing for Carlotta, and they start a romantic relationship, and they think, oh, this is the way we're going to... And Carlotta, who does like him, also thinks, well, this is a good way to save the plantation and protect the animal hybrids, so she's into him as well, but then things go awry. Always, yes. Basically, gosh, the drama's so up and down.
There's a bunch of drama, but basically Hernando shows up and is like, hey, no, you can't actually marry her. And his son is, no, I'm going to marry her. You know, I've slept with her. We've had sex, so Moreau's going to sue us.
The father is animate. You cannot be with her. And it's eventually revealed the father knows, oh, she's not really human. She's a hybrid. She was the example that convinced me that I need to invest because she seemed like such a perfect human. But the father knows you can't marry her. She's an abomination, basically. And she reveals this by, she turns jaguar. Her animal attributes come out.
He starts becoming very aggressive and violent towards Moreau and to herself. He's been a nuisance, honestly. But he starts acting very aggressive towards... I can't remember if it's Moreau or Montgomery at this point, but towards someone else. And so she, in a protective move, turns a little bit jaguar, like she has claws and fangs all of a sudden and whatnot, a kind of a shapeshifter vibe.
Little bit, yeah.
Because sometimes she's human and sometimes she has jaguar characteristics. So she attacks him.
Yes. Brutalizes him, doesn't kill him, but just really wounds him. And then the cat's out of the bag. They escape. She realizes, oh no, it's over. They're going to come back with more men. They're going to wipe out everyone here. So they send the hybrids out. They send them off into the jungle with the rebels, because this whole time, that's another thing. Hernando's pretty convinced that the natives who are rebelling against the landowners, that they are being helped by the hybrids or somebody on the plantation. And it comes out that it's true. The only human, Ramona, it's discovered Ramona's been helping the rebels. So Carlotta tells the hybrids to go hide out with the rebels while she, Montgomery, and a few others, like her best friend that's a sister to her that's one of the animal hybrids.
Oh, Lupe?
Lupe, yeah, that was her name. She was like Carlotta's handmaid, but really they were like sisters to one another.
Yes, and that's a big thing, is she does view the hybrids as family.
Yeah, but the key, though, is Carlotta can't leave because Monroe was wounded and is super sick, and they can't move him or they're afraid he's going to die. And he's on death's bed, so she and Montgomery stay on the plantation, basically at the third act of the novel, just waiting for Hernando and his men to show up to try to kill them.
And a little bit plot twist, they end up dead.
Yes.
I don't think we need to go into all the specifics of that.
Yeah, don't need to go into the proof, but basically she takes them out.
The point is that the hybrids help them, and they end up killing the people.
Everyone. Yes. Which she does a good job, the author, building up. Because I just kept thinking, these animal hybrids are eventually going to turn on them. They're going to become these great guerrilla warfare soldiers in the jungle. And that's exactly what happens. They basically take them all out in the jungle when they try to come and hunt them down.
Yeah, and I did kind of like that. I saw it coming, though. There's a moment where Carlotta says, you guys have to leave. You need to go with this. There's a backdrop of the historical context of Mayan people not wanting to work on the haciendas because, plantations. So there's kind of a war going on in that way. And so, there's natives nearby. We've been helping them. They're going to help us. So all the hybrids leave their homes and whatever, and they're going to be gone. So Carlotta thinks that they're all by themselves. And then at one point they show up and they're like, well, we're going to chase down the hybrids. And all I thought was, if this isn't an ambush, I'm going to be so disappointed right now.
Also, and you've made this comment, maybe this is where we're going to move into themes a little bit, because you were adamant about how this didn't need to be science fiction per se, because really it's all symbolic of the lower class native people rising up and fighting against the upper class colonizing people.
Which they bring up plenty of times.
A lot of times.
Oh, it's a good thing that you have white skin and light eyes versus Carlotta, who has dark skin, dark eyes, but he still loves her despite looking like that, and they have a church where Eve looks like her, and it's important to her.
Yeah, so the post-colonial themes in this book are very present. So I think it fits in that it shows the animal hybrids at the end rising up against the people who are trying to basically enslave them and fight back. It shows that class tension that is inevitably going to be happening, because it's really the whole book's a commentary on the colonialization that happened on the Yucatan Peninsula. So it's appropriate. The climax fits into the theme of the novel.
Yeah, because the comment I made to you is, I picked this book for October thinking, Mexican Gothic, this isn't going to be another horror. We read Monroe, and you're like, yeah, some people view this as a horror book. And it's like, okay, so this is going to be a horror book again. No, I would classify it as a historical fiction romance.
It's still horror.
If you change the hybrids to actual sick people at a clinic, it would not change the story functionally in any way. Not saying that it should, but I was surprised.
But it's still horror. Horror doesn't always have to be slasher film, jump scare.
But I don't even think it's gothic.
It is gothic in the sense that it is the macabre, the grotesque, the what's the word of the one guy who likes the creepy body mortification stuff?
I have no idea.
Give me a second.
Whoever you list is a person I need to stay away from.
Yeah, you do. Cronenberg. David Cronenberg, he's a director. He likes to direct movies where one of his most famous is 1986's The Fly with Jeff Goldblum. He plays a man who is creating a transportation device, and accidentally there's a fly inside of it when he tests it, and ends up splicing his DNA with the fly, and the whole movie's watching his body slowly decompose and fall apart. That's horror. It's a horror movie. He does a lot of horror movies, but his horror movies aren't like slasher or jump scares or possession or anything like that. It's how gross and devastating it is to watch your body do nasty things. And that's what the Island of Doctor Moreau is in its horror classification. It's body mutilation. It's deformity. It's the disturbing and the uncanny valley of it all.
I just wasn't scared at any point.
That's the problem. Horror doesn't have to be scary. If you were to do a Venn diagram, there are lots of movies of horror that are scary, but then there's lots of horror movies that aren't scary but disturbing.
I'm going to trust you on this.
You're like, I'm still not convinced.
I'm not. They focus so much on the romance.
As someone who hates jump scares, I appreciate horror that doesn't have to do jump scares. I appreciate horror that relies on the disturbing.
I just came in this with Mexican Gothic energy, and it's not that. I think that was unfair for me to set it up like that.
I think it's still Halloween. Werewolves? I mean, werewolves aren't scary. I mean, they can be in some movies, but in other movies, it's just the aspect of a body turning into something.
Fair. A lot of paranormal romance out there. Which, if you want to play a drinking game with this book,
yes,
take a shot every time Carlotta or Montgomery say the word coward.
Okay, I didn't notice that. Did you make note of that? Is there a lot?
Oh my gosh, constantly. I'm a coward. You're a coward. I'm being cowardly. Coward, coward, coward. Hit a thesaurus. It's part of the theme, I know, but a little part of me was like, guys, I don't think I've said the word coward that many times in my life.
Well, they are not cowards at the end.
No.
They rise up, fight off the evil people trying to hunt them down. But of course, once they kill them all off and they're able to escape, now they have the problem of finding a place for the animal hybrids to live. So Carlotta basically moves to the city and is doing the best she can to get funds, her father's estate.
She gets an inheritance from Moreau.
She does, because Dr. Moreau's family has disowned him, but now they're reaching out and she's trying to find out how to get money for the hybrids.
So what ends up happening is Moreau writes a will and says, hey, I have this amount of money that is owed to me from our parents passing.
Yeah, but his brother disowned him.
Yes, his brother has that money. And so, hey, you should give it to her. And so his family's coming back around going, she's his natural daughter, aka parents were not married. And so they're upset that a natural daughter is trying to get his funds, plus she's a woman. And so their thing is, okay, we'll give you the money, but you can't use your last name. You can't ever try to contact any of us.
Yes.
Which, by the way, he's from France instead of England, which I think was interesting. But she gets this inheritance, but she basically has to get rid of everything that is connected to her father.
Yeah. His last name's French.
It is, but I think, I don't know.
I don't know if it ever specifies in the original book.
It just specifies there was an event 10 years ago in London.
He was disgraced from London, yes.
So, I don't know. They never got that specific.
No, they didn't. So I guess she just chose, and since his last name is French, she just made him from France. That works out. But yeah, she's basically trying to use that money to find a safe haven for the animal hybrids. And Montgomery has to go out and find them all because they haven't found them all yet. They're out in the woods and stuff, still hiding. So the novel ends basically with him going out to go search for them and Carlotta staying in the city to try to further her efforts to get the funding. And it's a bittersweet ending again, just like Mexican Gothic.
Yes, where Mexican Gothic was, oh, maybe one day we'll be haunted by this again.
Mexican Gothic left it, we could have a happy ending or we could have a bad ending. It's kind of up in the air. It ends with them saying we're just going to try to face what we can together.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how this one ends too, because Montgomery and Carlotta
do not get together.
They do not. They've fallen in love with each other.
But in different ways.
In different ways. And he has a duty to do and she has a duty to do. And there's a hope that one day they'll see each other again once their tasks are done and they could be together. But she ends it again with there's no guarantee. I like that about her endings. It's always this, there's a possibility, we'll have to see, and I'm going to leave it at that so you, the reader, can speculate, are they going to have a happy ending? And I like that. It's a very realistic ending because it's this, we could have a happily ever after, but it depends. And that's just how real life is.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of symbolism in this one, unlike the Harry Turtle Doves where they're pretty straightforward.
Because they're mid-lit, yeah.
Yeah, about mid-lit. I could go on and on about the themes and symbolism and critical analysis about H.G. Wells. And this book, too, it has a lot in it that can be analyzed.
Speaking of which, to talk about the themes and analyze it. So one thing I want to point out is, and you definitely pointed out the historical and cultural context, which I think that's why Moreau is French, is because during that time period, and they bring it up with Montgomery, oh, you English are just trying to take our people and whatever. There was actually a huge conflict between the Spaniards in Mexico and the British. So Moreau, being French, makes him kind of a third party. He doesn't have alliances either way. But I didn't understand most of this book why she picked Island of Doctor Moreau to be inspired by. It felt like for a majority of the book, to me, that it was one of those Hollywood movies where they buy a book and they use the title and then the movie is something completely different.
I agree with that as a very fair assessment. It is a bit of a, famous book title, a play on that. That's about it. I feel it's very loosely connected to the Island of Dr. Moreau.
And so I just didn't understand why she did it. She's a very talented writer. She's also very into speculative fiction. We found out that she has helped edit short story anthologies. She's written a lot of books about stuff, and she's very knowledgeable. And clearly, she knows the source material very well to be inspired by the book. You can definitely see the threads back to the book. It's not completely like Hollywood, where you're just, who is this? Where are we? What? No, none of this makes sense. There is a connection. And so I was just so confused for most of the book why we were doing this. Probably like a third of the way in. That's when I made the comment to you, this doesn't feel like horror. This feels like historical fiction romance. And it really wasn't until the very, very end. Literally Carlotta killing Hernando's son, which I think is maybe the last chapter before the epilogue. I'm pretty sure. So it wasn't until the very end of the book that I finally felt like it clicked and I got it. Something I did notice about when I read The Island of Dr. Moreau, all of the characters are male.
Oh, yes. I was actually about to mention that because you were like, why did she pick this? And I said, I thought this is a very good compliment to what H.G. Wells was trying to do, what he was trying to share when he wrote The Island of Dr. Moreau. But it's also a very good criticism of his lacking, which is he has a very male perspective, a very end of the 19th century male perspective on things. And I kind of like she's taking that and showing a more feminist perspective on it. Something that H.G. Wells, complicated as he is, considered himself probably a feminist for his time, but by today's standards, he's not a feminist. So to me, when you said, why'd she pick this? I thought, well, this is great because she's basically taking what Wells wanted to attempt and making it better by showing his shortcomings, which is, as you said, everyone is male in the book. It is all male perspective, male mentality, and this book is a very counter to that because it's a very female perspective.
Because even while reading the book, I thought, me being me, this would be so much different if a woman was on this island. And that's what she does. She takes the feminine narrative, she takes the feminine experience and inserts it into the book. And by making Carlotta one of the two narrators, I think she does play back and forth on it. And like I said, she's the personification of the empathy that Moreau lacks. She is a nurturing person. She is very intelligent in her own way, but it's still it's hard to explain. Men and women are different, believe it or not.
Yes.
And so her being a young Mexican woman and adding that into the narrative, and you basically see how the story changes because she's there and she's part of the narrative, but you also see how it doesn't change. And so I really do think when we're talking about what do we owe to our creations, if you don't have the feminine narrative, literally what do? We create things.
It's funny you mentioned the men and women different because that is a shortcoming that Wells was a part of on starting in the science fiction, speculative fiction genre. And I even have a book over here on my science fiction shelf called A New Species. If you pull it out and look at it, it says Gender and Science in Science Fiction. It's a book all about how the woman or the female has always been viewed as alien in science fiction. Wells is a perfect example of that. The only real female in his book, The Island of Dr. Moreau, is the puma. That Dr. Moreau is trying to turn from a cat into a person, which is a woman.
Yeah, they mention other females, but kind of in passing, like, oh, that's a female one, and there's two male ones, and then they do a thing and they run off.
Yeah, but the only humans in his book are male. The humans as in, quote, unquote, they were born human, not the animals turned into humans. Except for this one puma, who is being turned into a woman. It started this trope where women are looked at as the strange, the different, the other. I mean, you think of a couple examples. I think one of the most famous and common is the 50s movie, The 80-Foot Woman, I think is what it's called. It's something foot woman. I forget the number. 100 foot, 80 foot, something like that. But it's all about this whole, the woman is strange and other, and really woman and animal are lumped together in this regard. So it's really nice that she is putting a female perspective of the puma basically into this narrative and saying, basically, this is what she sees.
Yeah, and this is how she reacts, and I feel like this had to come from a female author.
Oh, yeah.
So Moreau's name is in the title, but Moreau feels more like a foil to her than the main character in a lot of ways, which I'm okay with. I'm not a huge fan of Moreau as a person in general. I think we would never get along ever, but...
I mean, I guarantee he's meant to be viewed as a foil.
Because in the original book, it's a clash of ideals, but not really. It's like, oh, here are some ideas, but let's take this a little farther. Where this one, he feels like every time he shows up, it's just to show off different characteristics of Carlotta, which is good. Sit over in the corner and think about what you did. Sorry. This is not my review of Island of Dr. Moreau and my personal dislike towards him. I mean, that's the point, I think, in some ways. But personal bias seeping in, I'm getting out of it. It's fine. It just really hit me that that's what this is. And I think it really adds... I don't have anything to add. You already said all the words.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. It adds really well to it. And that's what I thought, oh, this isn't just book. This is literature. Where she's not just trying to entertain you. She's trying to have a conversation. And I think she's adding to the conversations that were already brought up in Monroe.
I think you just gave a really good, I might have to use that from now on, a really good definition of the difference between little literature with a lowercase L and high literature with a uppercase L.
Oh, yeah. Pop art versus elite art.
Yeah, it's a question of entertainment versus conversation. I like that.
Yeah.
Is this just wanting to entertain you, or is this want to prompt a conversation?
Because if we were going to treat Island of Dr. Moreau as literal literature, I'd be like, man, this sucks. This is kind of boring. I don't like all the characters and whatever. But you put it and you take it an L. It's like, isn't that the point, though?
The conversation.
We're not just supposed to read the book, have it through our little filter and be like, okay, cool, whatever, and move on. Like other books, we're supposed to actually think with a capital T.
Why I like the book, for sure. I like the conversation. Well, and I told you this when you mentioned you thought it was mediocre. And I tried to emphasize, well, you got to realize this is one of the first books where it was trying to use science to say human beings and animals aren't as different as we think they are. That really human beings have an animalistic nature to them.
And what makes us human and what makes them animal.
Exactly. And today that conversation's been done, that type of story that prompts that conversation has been done so much that the original looks kind of mediocre now. But we have to remember this was the conversation starter. This is the, what if we could turn animals into humans? I mean, we have plenty of other literature stories that talk about that today, but this was one of the first that really made an impact. And I like that.
Which is always important. This is the first. He's the first guy to be like, we should have a conversation about it. And then everyone after it was like, yeah, we should have a conversation. And they've built on it and they've thought about it. And ethics and values have changed. And so they talked about it again. And so we've gotten not to the end of the conversation, obviously. But we're on chapter like 20, 22, comparing it to this guy's. We should be glad that he was like, we should have this conversation. Somebody's got to do it.
Yes. And, you know, I wrote a paper on it discussing the transhumanist and posthumanist implications in the Island of Dr. Moreau.
Transhumanism being what is the next step for evolution of man is some sort of hybrid between man and something else versus posthumanism, which says the next step in evolution is not humans.
Exactly.
To give a very brief,
yeah. Transhumanist says, how could humanism transform into something better, right? You go from mediocre human to enhanced human, whether it be cybernetics or genetic mutation or something like that. But it's still human at its core. It's just amplified in some way, where posthumanists are asked the question, why are we putting the human as the center? Who's to say the human is the most dominant, best thing out there?
The world has existed before humans. The world's going to exist after humans.
And our perspective is always going to be tainted and biased to the human.
Because we're a species that wants to survive.
Exactly. So Wells's book has implications for both, as does The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, right? It says, yeah, we want to be better human beings. So transhumanism is still a goal, but introducing the animal hybrid, introducing the perspective of the other shows that posthumanism has a point, which I've been reading a book on posthumanism lately. And really the point of posthumanism is to question our assumptions about humanity. And that's what both books do. It's pushing us to question what we assume about humanity. It makes me think of an article that I get my students in my English class to read called An Animal's Place. And the author in it is discussing the meat industry and the ethics of it. Is it ethically sound to be slaughtering animals so often every day? Do we have an ethical responsibility as humans to treat these animals we slaughter with some dignity, right? And they ask questions in the essay. The question in the essay is whether we should treat these animals kindly is, do they suffer, right? We have to ask these questions. What counts as intelligence? What counts as consciousness? Because we might say, oh, we are better than animals because we can communicate. Oh, we're better than animals because we can have family relationship or feel emotions like love or empathy or things like that, which we've always said animals can't feel. But science is showing it's a bit more complicated than that. And it's difficult to basically define the line, what makes us animal and what makes us human. The essay makes the example of, well, we'll say, oh, we're smarter than a chimp. That's why a human's better than a chimp. And then the essay points out, well, there's some human beings who are born less intelligent than a chimp. Does that mean that they are less human than a chimpanzee? They were like, well, no, of course not. They're like, well, what's your criteria then? Because you already set out your criteria. You're saying intelligence, and already you're backtracking on that. So that's really the goal of posthumanism. It's trying to make us realize when we try to define something like this is human, this is not human, there can be complications to that. We always have to be careful on the way we define things, or we end up like Wells this time where we say, well, these humans are better than those humans. There's my rant.
Only one. Lies.
Definitely not a couple dozen so far.
To give him a little bit of a props, I think it's kind of cool that considering his time period that he was like, I mean, are we though? Are we? Because like you said, they were using Darwinism to excuse racism. Just facts.
They were. And not to say Wells didn't fall into that. He had his racist tendencies too. What he was obsessed with was what was called de-evolution, which is a common theme in science fiction. Wells was worried that if we're not careful, we can de-evolve into something. Just like the Morlocks in the Time Machine or the animal hybrids. That's what happens in the Island of Doctor Moreau. When Moreau dies and the animals don't have that structure they had, that religion, worshiping Dr. Moreau, the laws that were placed like the 10 Commandments for them to follow.
Oh, we haven't even gotten to the religious implications of stuff. Oh my gosh, so many.
Yeah, I know. But that's why that part of the book is important. Why Dr. Moreau, our antagonist, kind of dies 2/3 of the way through the book. And we have that third part where Pendrick is there watching the animals slowly devolve back into their animal states. That is Wells's warning saying, hey, we could de-evolve. That's his transhumanist side warning saying, we got to hold on to our humanity. We cannot assume we're just better and human. We have the animal potential within us, and we need to fight that. That's where the social commentary Wells comes out. He's trying to encourage people to fight against our animalistic behavior. He's saying it's always there, and we need to be ready to fight against that.
No one's above it.
Yeah, exactly. So in that regard, he's not fully post-human. Wells, unfortunately, would probably, and I have books here to back this up, quotes from him, but he definitely had this viewpoint that some humans were better than other humans evolutionary. Well, I'll just put it that way. He believed all humans should be treated fairly, but he definitely thought that some humans were better than other humans.
Gosh, there's so many directions we can go. Yeah, the religious implications are taken definitely farther in this book. Because in the other one, it's, oh, you should worship me. And it feels kind of a safety thing.
Well, he never encourages it, but he never discourages it in the book.
He encourages it by disciplining.
Exactly. Well, the thing is, he doesn't say, hey, look at me as a god, but he does discipline them.
And he's like, fear me.
And it turns into God worship, and he doesn't stop it. He just lets it happen. He's not encouraging it, but he's not stopping it.
It feels like a safety thing for him to be like, if they worship me, they're not going to come to me in the middle of the night and murder me in my sleep.
Exactly. He didn't create the religion, but once it became a thing, he was like, okay, I'll swing into the punch. I'll indulge them on this whole fear me as a god thing.
Which I think is a super interesting look at how religions can be formed.
Yes, it's very important at this point to point out that H.G. Wells was a very well-known atheist. He did not believe in God or religion. He had very negative views about all that.
I'm not surprised by that at all.
Yeah, he was conflicted, though. His mother was very religious. His father, well, not so much. But his mother was religious to the point of his upbringing had a twinge of religious guilt to it. So a lot of people have analyzed analyzed his works and saw the contrast in him, because there's a part of him that has a religious implication, and it shows up in stuff like the Island of Dr. Moreau and other ways too. Some people have talked about his imagery of gardens and stuff seeming to reference the Garden of Eden. So people argue that there's a conflict in him. He wants to be atheist, he wants to be no God and stuff like this, but there is a side of him that struggles with that. And I think it shows in the Island of Dr. Moreau as well.
I mean, it literally is a jungle island. It's basically the Garden of Eden.
Basically, it's a Garden of Eden trope. But yeah, Wells was anti-religion, and it shows in his books.
Not surprised by that at all, yeah. But she takes it a step further in The Daughter of Dr. Monroe, because he's a preacher. He goes up there on Sundays and gives sermons to them. He's basically like, I am God of this jungle area, so by worshiping God, you should worship me.
Which feeds into the theme of colonialism during that time period.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Plantation owners would view themselves, I am called of God to be over you as your master.
God, gold, and glory.
Exactly. So that's a reflection of that, a commentary on it for sure.
Oh my gosh, it kind of hits.
Yes, it does. Here's your husband again. He wants to go down the critical theory rabbit hole.
Go ahead. That's why I invite you on here.
Friedrich Nietzsche. He's the famous German philosopher who said the phrase, God is dead and we have murdered him. Nietzsche promoted the Übermenschen, the Superman. He believed that since God is dead, it is up to the exceptional person, whether they be someone like Napoleon or some great leader or some person who can determine their own ethics. They can set the standard. They can determine what is good and what is bad. And the implications of that, I think that's what Wells is playing with as well. I would say Wells advocates for this concept, not per se the Übermenschen, but the concept of we can control our destiny when it comes to ethics and society and how it can be a better place, a utopia. But Wells's novels, especially in his early period, are littered with the warnings of where this could lead if we don't do it right. I think Monroe is an example of that, of how the false Übermenschen, if you could say, the false Superman can lead us astray. And I think she plays into that as well with Monroe and Hernandez and all these people. And I think that shows when she makes one of her protagonists, Montgomery, who is a person who's constantly familiar with failure, and it humbles him and it makes him a better person. Eventually. Not to say he's a perfect person and not to say he hasn't done anything wrong, but he's held up versus Monroe and the other male characters that he has made mistakes, and that's made him aware that he is not perfect, if you could say.
He's very aware that he is not perfect. That's part of the reason he drinks.
Exactly. But I think that's the big theme in both these books, and why the conversation isn't about can animals become human? The conversation is always what makes us human.
Yep.
And the flaw of thinking, I'm a perfect human, I've done everything right. Montgomery and the hybrids and all these other things happening in the novel are supposed to show we aren't perfect. We always screw up. Being human is not a I've arrived situation. I have now achieved humanity. Humanity is a constant effort. And you joked about the word coward, but that's a good example. They constantly have to learn and fail and strive to achieve what it means to have courage. It's a human quality, right?
Yes.
Think about it. An animal can be brave, but courage is putting your own needs aside to rush in to save someone or protect someone or to do something out of your comfort zone or putting yourself into danger. We would say that is a human quality. We would not say an animal would do something like that.
I mean, we'd say a dog would do that.
Yeah, and again, that's where it breaks down. I'm saying, oh, human would do this. And you're like, well, a dog does that. And you're like, well, crap, there you go. That isn't exclusively human. What I'm saying is the courage, right? It's showing what does it mean to be human? It means to fail and strive to try again.
And just to go a little bit back to the human narrative, especially considering the time period and everything she has is so firmly tied to her father, having this male authority figure in her life that thinks he's God, equivalent of everything he does is right, but it's not his fault that all of his experiments failed. Oh, if people would just do it right, it's everybody else's fault. It's Hernando's fault for not giving him enough money. It's this fault or that fault, or it's everyone else's fault that I'm not succeeding. And so I'm just going to be upset about it and take it out on you. If that ain't a female experience. Oh my gosh.
Yes, unfortunately, that is very true.
But to go into that a little bit, am I the only one picking up that the author made him bipolar?
Dr. Monroe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, bipolar is exactly what you thought, but he does have a, I don't know, unstableness about him.
He specifically goes in between, and she points this out, he goes through periods of Great Depression where he doesn't do anything, just stares at the picture of his late wife, doesn't do anything, barely eats, she has to make sure he stays alive, and then he'll cycle through and have these manic, where he has these delusions of grandeur about himself, he's very productive, he's doing all these things, the over-the-top manicness of it. He's basically God, everybody else's fault. In fact, that's when he gets those angry moments. Sometimes when he's manic and someone's holding him back from him reaching his manic potential that he's wanting to go to. So it just came really clear to me that he seemed to be bipolar, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. That's a good theory. I like that.
Yeah, because you got to have delusions of grandeur to try to pull this off, just in general. So
that's true.
Your normal person isn't out here doing it.
Yeah, that's true.
She's brought mental illness into the conversation. So I could go on and on about how I think it's interesting how the daughter is having to put up with her father's mental illness because no one knows that he's mentally ill, but she's having to make sure he's alive when he's depressed and stuff. And she's his caretaker.
Yep, basically.
And no one says anything. No one's like, hey, Monroe, be a father. No one's saying that to him. I mean, granted, who's there? Ramona and Montgomery, who both work for him. But no one's telling him to calm down. Even Hernando is like, yeah, no, be more crazy. Be more. Actually get me stuff and things, because you find out the only reason Carlotta's so human is because she was born via surrogacy, sort of? Not, but a human woman gave birth to her versus normal, he's been using pig wombs.
Yes, he's been using pig wombs, and he thinks that's why he's failing, because the only successful one is when he got a woman volunteer to hold the animal hybrid in her womb.
Yes, which I thought was very interesting, because if you want a more physical representation, he wasn't able to get a perfect human because he was literally leaving women a female egg.
That is true.
Human female egg was left out, and that's what was needed to create this perfect human. If you want a very physical representation of that.
That's a good point.
But it killed her, and he has some ethics in there. It's like, I can't do that again. Can't just be murdering these women out in these streets, except at the end when he's like, well, I really should have.
Yeah, ethics is a strong word. I think he was looking more economically at it. You can't just keep killing off random women, no matter who they are. It wasn't sustainable, which is what he was looking for his patron.
True. That part was through Carlotta's eyes, so she might have softened the edge for me a little bit, because she wants to believe that he's ethical. She wants to believe that he has good intentions. It's not until near the end of the book that she's like, you suck.
Yeah.
Which, oh my gosh, how many children are so convinced that their parents, what they're doing is right and what they think is right, and once they're a parent, they'll understand, but when they become an adult, they realize, you're abusive. That's not a normal experience.
Yes, there are quite a few stories like that.
So adding that into the story, she's got so many conversations she's just added into this book. It's great.
Yeah.
So all in all, if you're going to come at this book with a capital L, highly recommend. If you're going to come at this with a lowercase l, I still kind of recommend it.
Oh, yeah.
I would recommend it more than I would recommend Dr. Moreau as a lowercase l.
I think the best books are the ones that do both big L and little l, because I've read some books that are big L that never in a million years would I read them as a little l. They're not very entertaining. They're a little full of themselves. And I've read little L's that are fun to read, but I'm thinking there's no real big L happening here, no conversation. So it's nice when you find a book that does both.
This is the physical equivalent of popcorn.
Exactly. I've read a few of those.
Not that I don't love me some popcorn, but it's not a meal.
And I've read books that were torture, so I got a whole spectrum. And I keep reading them because for some reason I like torturing myself.
So general thoughts. Okay, here's one more thing I thought of. As someone who is a scholar of the history of speculative fiction, I have a question to you on modern versus H.G. Wells' time in the beginning, and maybe even as early as the 1930s, 1950s to now. I noticed in Dr. Moreau, Island of, I don't know why I said it like it was a library catalog.
I have no idea. You mean Wells's Island of Dr. Moreau?
I noticed in the original, they keep it to a minimum. They just say, oh, he does vivisection, and then he mentions, oh, I hear the puma screaming, which, by the way, that got me. Oof, that got me. But he does vivisection. He goes into the lab, and he sees stuff. And whatever, and then you just go on. You're like, okay, yeah, vivisection, he can create humans. Totally. This book went into a rather detailed explanation of DNA. They call it something else, but DNA, basically. And it's like, oh, well, this is how it's happening, and here's how I do it every single day, and here are the daily effects of it and stuff. Do you think modern sci-fi readers require more explanation? Because I felt more satisfied when I got more explanation, because I thought the whole time when I was reading, how do you cut, how do you vivisection into a human? And you kind of just have to go with it, but...
So first off, the vivisection is because H.G. Wells, before he became a school teacher and before he became a famous author, when he was younger, went to school. He actually went to college studying biology under, I forget his name, Huxley. There was a guy in England with the last name Huxley. He was a very famous biologist. People gave him the nickname, if I'm not mistaken, the Bulldog of Darwin. He took what Darwin discovered and he went at it like a bulldog. He latched onto it, and he was a big advocate and fighter for evolution. And he taught biology. He taught science, basically, at the university that Wells went to. Probably didn't lecture too many classes. He had other teachers lecture for him. Huxley did, while Wells was there.
You know, a higher education.
Yeah, well, he was also, I think, busy and sick at the time. So people speculate if Wells really rubbed shoulders with him much. Probably not much at all. But Wells became fascinated with Huxley. And a lot of people say that a lot of Wells's views on evolution came from Huxley's books and papers and speeches about it. But the key here is that one of the things he would do in that biology class is vivisection. It was the popular thing to do then, of cutting things open and experimenting with the body parts of animals. So that is why Wells uses it. He was familiar with vivisection. That was about the height of scientific explanation at that time. So that's why he was using that. So for Wells's audience, it'd be like you hearing her talking about genetic evolution and stuff. She's hitting all the familiar notes that we have seen in other sci-fi trope stories about genetic mutation of animals into humans.
Yeah, and I won't say she tries to explain it, because I've read science fiction books that try to explain it, and you're just like, you don't know what science is. So she doesn't overly explain it, but I just noticed that one seemed to be, oh, he does a thing. Oh, okay, we're just going to keep going with that, versus this, where I felt like she had a need to explain more.
And I would say with modern audiences, again, science fiction was a new genre, or a budding genre during Wells's time. So for him to mention what he did was the height of scientific explanation, just as what she's doing is the height of scientific explanation. There is a need from the audience. It's called verisimilitude, this desire that the story needs to sound like it makes sense. Edgar Allan Poe is a popular one of this, where if you explain something, it needs to connect in the reader in the way where they go, oh, that could be true. That sounds like it could be true. It helps them suspend their disbelief. We know that genetic mutation like this couldn't exist today, but if you give us a good enough explanation, if you spin it in a certain way where it sounds like it's plausible, the reader accepts it. That's what both are doing. We just are from a different century. So Wells's explanation seems a little lacking and dated, where hers seems adequate and appropriate.
There you go. I was just curious, because I also wonder a little bit if the base education level, since that has increased, that we require more now.
Yes, that has a big part too. There's been studies on how in the 19th century England, the reading public greatly changed. It's actually, Wells was a big part of it, the pulp fiction. At the beginning of the 19th century, the popular thing were trilogy books and libraries where you would go rent a book from it, and novels were really popular, and you'd come out with installments of the novels. That's like why books like Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens and stuff always came out with their books in installments, right? But then when you get to the later part of the 19th century, as the public began to read more and get more educated, as stories were more printed instead of on nice books in pulp magazines, very cheap paper where you can print a whole bunch of them and it didn't cost much for the reader, that changed the format of our storytelling. We then shifted from novel formats to short stories and entire books being cut up into tiny chapters. If you notice the Island of Dr. Moreau, every chapter was about the same length, right?
Yes.
That's because Wells would often write in a way where it could be released in chapter installments every week or month. The next chapter comes out. So the public was becoming more literate during Wells's time.
I don't even know if we've mentioned her name yet. The author's name is Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and I just feel like you and her could have a great conversation.
Probably. I'd be intimidated. She's probably way smarter than me.
But it seems that you have a lot of the same interests.
Probably, yeah. I mean, we could probably geek out about science stuff. Though I say probably, she's definitely way smarter than me.
But still, I think you guys could have a funny conversation.
Yeah, I would enjoy, let's say that. I don't know if I'd be very entertaining to her, but she would be a fun person to talk to probably, for me.
That's fair.
Sorry, I'm debasing myself here. I know that's silly.
You're doing the thing where it's a celebrity, so you're just like, oh my goodness, no, don't look at me.
I know, we've talked about this. When I meet famous people, I panic that I'm going to do something stupid.
It's just like anytime we talk about, oh, you should totally talk to Harry Dirtledove, and you're like, oh my gosh, I could never.
Anyone famous.
All right, one question for the author, though. To go kind of along with it, I wonder who her favorite sci-fi writer is.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that.
Because she's obviously cultured. She could probably list sci-fi writers like you can, and I can for mystery. Like, if we wanted to talk about mystery authors, I could bam, 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 bam. But you could do that for sci-fi, and I bet she could too. And so I'd be curious, maybe even not specifically a writer, but maybe what genres she likes the most.
I know she's been an editor of an anthology.
Two, and one of them was on zombies, and I can't remember what the other one was on. So she's done monster stuff. She's written fantasy books. She's written romance and horror.
Yeah, I guarantee she's very familiar with some good authors.
So I'd just be curious, if she was going to pick a sci-fi genre to read as a little L, what would she pick?
Geez, I'm going to steal your question. I want to know what books she would say. If someone came up and said, what sci-fi books do you suggest? What would she list?
See, but that gets me. I'm like, okay, are you a new reader to sci-fi? What have you read? And I'd be all into that. But yes.
Despite those questions, because yes, that would change probably answers depending on. But if you just, real quick, shoot, what sci-fi books would you suggest to someone? What would it be? Because I know I do something like, probably Foundation by Asimov, or gosh, something by Heinlein for sure. That's a tough question. That's like asking your favorite book. She'd probably get upset if I asked her a question like that.
Rating.
I would give this a Puma out of 10. I say Pumbaa because I think that's the linchpin between these two. I feel the base effort out of this novel, The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, is to give the Puma's side of the story, because the Puma is one of the most interesting characters from the original novel, and I felt like this whole book is a way of giving that perspective. I think it's a good commentary to the original Island of Dr. Moreau. I think it's a good companion to it. I would highly recommend anyone who's read Island of Dr. Moreau to definitely read Daughter of Dr. Moreau.
I would give this traveling out of 10. I think it helps broaden your perspectives a little bit. It can be enjoyable, it can be scary, it can be exciting, it can be boring, but in the end, you feel better for it.
That's true.
Because, I had a lot of feelings about this. Read again, / you like the question, would you recommend it to someone else? And you clearly do.
Yeah, I would recommend it to someone else. Yeah, the rereading question's the worst one to ask because I'm not a big rereader, because I think I need to read another book I haven't read yet. I would recommend it to other people. In fact, I should recommend it to more people.
I put maybe, and I of course put my original thoughts. When I finished the book, I said maybe. But now that we've talked about it, I don't like it as much as Mexican Gothic, but I do like it a lot. I could see in a couple of years' time feeling like, yeah, I want to refresh my mind and have those conversations again. Because a little L, probably not. I have other things I'd want to reread, but as a big L, yes. But have you read this book? What's your favorite H.G. Wells story / who would you recommend if someone came up to you and asked, what sci-fi author should I read? Do you have any book recommendations for us? Tell us all about it in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit like, and if you're enjoying yourself, hit subscribe for more. Thank you for exploring The Daughter of Dr. Moreau with us. Join us next time when we'll be covering Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. I'm Sam Reiner.
And I'm James Reiner.
And we hope to see you and a friend here next time. Escape With Me Book Club is a Lunar Skulk production. Check us out on TikTok or Instagram to keep up to date with us. Lunar_SKULK.